listening to Sasquatch Syndicate.
911, what are you reporting?
We got someone or something crawling around out here.
Did you see what it was? Was it a person or an animal or?
I can't tell. All I know is that my central light came on and I just happened to glimpse and see this thing running across the yard.
And all the ape believers don't want any of the paranormal believers to say anything because they're all whacked and screwed up and we don't want them. And all the paranormal believers don't want to go to the ape believers saying, well, you're all closed-minded. You're not open to the fact that it does this and it does that.
And I look over my left shoulder and this creature is running through the woods and it's bulldozing the brush down. And I knew, man, this thing is going to get me.
Welcome to Sasquatch Syndicate. I'm your host, Chuck, out in Seattle, Washington, along with Paul in Portland, Oregon. Thanks to everyone for listening and those following us at SasquatchSyndicate.com and on our social media outlets. For those participating in the Sasquatch Syndicate monthly t-shirt giveaway, this month's winner was Darren Blaywick from East Carbon, Utah. So Darren, thanks for listening to the show, and please check your Facebook for winner notification. Happy February, everyone, and happy birthday to all of my Aquarius friends. Yes, I am Aquarius, and I am celebrating my birthday on February 7th. So although February kind of falls in a weird time of year, I always considered it to kind of be the bridge between winter and spring. So not only does my birthday happen, but certainly it reminds me spring's just around the corner. And maybe we should reflect on just what's so great about February and February 1st. So here's some folks born on February 1st you may recognize. Today, celebrating birthdays are Rhonda Rousey, Lisa Marie Presley, and some folks that have passed on, Clark Gable, Boris Yeltsin, and let us not forget the super freak himself, Rick James. Also some reminders on some pretty interesting events that happened on February 1st in history. Let us not forget 2004, where we had the infamous wardrobe malfunction during the Super Bowl with Justin Timberlake and Janet Jackson. In 1992, the Cold War ended on February 1st, and in 1898, the first auto insurance policy was issued. And in 1933, Groundhog Day was introduced. Speaking of the groundhog, he better not show his shadow tomorrow, as I have spring fever, and I'm absolutely ready for winter to be over. While I'm speaking of cold places, I should mention Hastings, Nebraska, as this month on February 15th through 17th, Harriet McFeely and friends will be hosting the second annual Nebraska Bigfoot Conference. This conference will be held at the Hastings City Auditorium at 400 North Hastings Avenue in Hastings, Nebraska. Special guests include Bob Gimlin, Cliff Berrickman, Mike Johnson, and many others. And as many of you know, I'm actually from Omaha, Nebraska. I grew up in South Omaha and began my career working with Watts Marketing of America, promoting shows such as Mutual of Omaha's Wild Kingdom, Mysteries of the Unknown by Time Life Books, and many others. So I do owe much of my success growing up to the state of Nebraska, and I really wish that you can all get out and make this event. So you're probably saying, are you going to make the event? Are you coming? Well, as much as I'm willing to promote the event, sadly, we're not going to be able to make this trip this year, as I really don't want to be caught in a flash freeze like a woolly mammoth. And one thing you should know about the state of Nebraska, it really helped me truly understand what winter is all about. And quite honestly, I hate the cold. So I may make it next year, but that shouldn't stop you from going. It's going to be fabulous. So if you're in the Midwest and willing to buck up and brave the Nebraska winter, you will not be disappointed. There's going to be a few special surprises and even a new film premiere. You can register and pick up your tickets at eventbrite.com and search for the Nebraska Bigfoot Conference 2018. And when you get there, let them know you heard it here at Sasquatch Syndicate. Also, speaking of events, this April, Sasquatch Syndicate will have a booth at Wenatchee Con, or WinCon, in Wenatchee, Washington. WinCon will be held Saturday, April 21st at the Town Toyota Center in Wenatchee, Washington. WinCon is a pop culture convention. It will have guest stars, media stars, vendors, artists, games, panel discussions, prizes, cosplay, and many, many other fun, and I mean fun, activities. It's an absolutely action-packed, one-day-only event from 10 a.m. to 6 p.m. You can buy your tickets now at wencon.com. That's WEN-CON.com. And we look forward to seeing you there in Wenatchee. So on to some quick business. This episode of Sasquatch Syndicate is proudly brought to you by Amazon.com. Since 1994, Amazon has been leading customer digital transformation and changed the way the world does business. Amazon is pleased to announce its latest device, the Echo Show. And now Echo Show can show you things. You can watch videos, see music lyrics, security cameras, photos, weather, to-do shopping lists, and now you can call almost anywhere hands-free. So the next time you're in the market for an upgraded smart home device, please check out the Echo Show. And don't forget, you can use our Amazon link whenever you're shopping at Amazon. They donate a small portion of what you purchase to Sasquatch Syndicate programs and events, and it costs you nothing. You can reach our Amazon link by going to sasquatchsyndicate.com, click donate, and then our Amazon link before you shop. And regardless if you do it or not, we're just humbled by the fact that you gave it consideration. So thanks for doing that. So on to this month's podcast. With us tonight on Sasquatch Syndicate, we are joined by researcher, teacher, and author Thom Powell. Thom is the author of Edges of Science. Edges of Science appeared on the Sasquatch Syndicate Book Club back in November 2016, and as many of you know, is one of Paul and I's favorite books over the past 2 years. So Thom, welcome to Sasquatch Syndicate, and if you wouldn't mind sharing your background for our listeners and really how you got into research.
Well, I guess it really found fertile ground when I moved rural and found neighbors in my immediate vicinity out there in Clackamas County, Oregon, who took the whole Sasquatch hypothesis seriously. And up until that point, I ridiculed the subject for the sake of a science lesson that I did each year in my classroom in Southwest Portland. So much to my surprise, when I moved to Clackamas County, Oregon from the Portland area, and I found people who said, we don't laugh at the Sasquatch thing out here. We have it. It's here. That gave me pause, because up to that point I had ridiculed it for the sake of the science lesson. So then I decided I had to sort of reconcile my cognitive dissonance and find out more about this thing. And so I started collecting, for instance, notices on the country store bulletin board of a guy who was actually collecting local sightings and so on. And so I called him up and said, what do you got? I need to know how deep this thing goes, whether it's valid or not. And, then he attempted to school me. And then from there, I decided, all right, I'll keep going. And then about that time, the internet was emerging. This was probably the mid-90s at this point. And so, the very first search engines were getting going. I remember Netscape, Navigator.
Yeah. Be careful, you're dating us.
And so here we all are sitting there with our Apple iMacs and looking for something to put this newfound computing power to work doing. And so there was all these people who were sort of searching the internet for Bigfoot information back in the mid-90s. And of course, one guy was sort of aware of this, and that would be Matthew Moneymaker, and he started his website, which at first was, of course, somewhat lame, but he did sort of develop it and get it looking fancy, and he really saw that you could gather an incredible amount of unconfirmed information using this newfound search engine capability. So I got involved with him just because I was looking for local information, and he actually had it. And he was actually at the point where he was becoming overwhelmed with sighting reports after he would get some attention on some sort of late night radio show like Art Bell, Coast to Coast. And all it really took back then is one spot on a show like that, and then in the next few days, he would be absolutely inundated with reports, and more than he could even, handle, investigate. So he was suddenly in need of a whole bunch of local people continent-wide, and so for a time there, everything that came his way from the whole Pacific Northwest region pretty much landed in my lap. So all of a sudden, I was privy to an enormous amount of information that wasn't being filtered by anybody. And then I just started trying to wade through it. And in the back of my mind, I was actually looking for a location where I could concentrate my energy. And I had this idea about these camera traps, trail cams, whatever you call them now. And they were a pretty expensive item back then. They didn't have any digital technology to them. It was just these film cameras back then. But whatever they were, that just seemed to me to be this promising technology. And so I was determined to find a place to apply it. And eventually somebody wrote in who was in the right place and had exactly the situation I was looking for. I really felt that there must be a place that gets repeat attention if these Sasquatch are indeed real. And I also understood by then that places like Mount Rainier in Washington are the kind of places that should have a concentration of Sasquatch activity. So darn if these people from the general Mount Rainier area didn't write in and say, oh yeah, we get them. And we'd like somebody to come out here because we're concerned about some logging in the area, and we're hoping to avert the logging destruction. And we also understand that we have these Sasquatches in our immediate vicinity. So, boy, I jumped on that one and got out there and got to know these people, and they were certainly receptive to the idea of putting trail cams out on their property. And so I basically got busy and started doing that, and started out in just money out of my own pocket. But then there were these key guys, and one of them is this guy in San Diego, Richard Hucklebridge, who put up some of their money, and they were sort of a philanthropist with a Sasquatch inclination. So we started getting money and putting the cameras out, and I thought, okay, this is just going to take a few weeks. We're going to have pictures of Bigfoot. It's all going to be over. I'm going to pretty much answer the mystery, and that'll be that. I'll be on to the next thing. Well, every time I put the cameras on a location that had something happening, their freezer, they had an outdoor freezer that was getting hit. And so, of course, it was a no-brainer. We're going to put the cameras on the freezer. Well, guess what? It just didn't work. The activity wouldn't necessarily leave the property, but it would shift. The freezer would then not get hit anymore, and then we would move our cameras to another location on the property because then it was happening there, and then the freezer would start getting hit again. And so little by little, I started to notice something that I just didn't expect, and that is that they potentially understood what we were doing with the cameras, and they weren't buying it. And that, of course, blew my mind because I was pretty much towing the line that Matt Moneymaker was laying down at that point, and that is that it's just a wild ape. It's just like the mountain gorillas of Africa. We haven't caught them yet, but we will with just a few simple tricks. Well, it just didn't work. And little by little, it started to become painfully obvious that they were on to us. And then a guy that Ray Crow, we had this local icon of Bigfootery, Ray Crow, who would have monthly meetings in a used bookstore and discuss Sasquatch. And I started attending his things. And so then he started sending me people that he didn't know what to do with. And one of these people was a gentleman named Steve Fredericks, who said that he was actually having some degree of contact with them, telepathic, dream state, that kind of stuff. So, of course, people like that are seen by most of the world as crazy. Anybody who's hearing voices must be crazy. But, this guy called me up and was saying what his experiences were with a straight face. And so even then, I just sort of decided to shut up and let this guy talk, hear him out. And he was saying that you can communicate with him. Well, I thought, okay, perfect. I know where there are Sasquatches, and that's out there at Alan and April's property by Mount Rainier. So if there's anything to this idea that you can communicate directly with the Sasquatch, these people should have it. So I took Steve Fredericks' claims to them and said, there's this guy who says you can communicate, and I figured that if that's true, then you would have to know. So what do you say? And Alan looked at April, and April looked at Alan, and there was this awkward pause. And then they shrugged their shoulders and they said, yeah, we get that. we get that. And I was stunned. I guess not what I expected. I expected them to roll their eyes and dismiss it. And they said, no, we definitely have that. And I was pretty shocked. So I said, well, I've been coming here for 2 years. Well, why didn't you tell me this before? And they said, well, we didn't want you to think we were crazy. And I said, well, all right, you're not crazy. Now tell me what's going on. And they said, well, April gets it the most, or actually our daughter Nina gets it more than April, but the women in the household seem to experience it most often. But we get these voices, or they'll enter our dreams.
So, Thom, we hear quite often that women and children seem to be more amenable to Sasquatch interactions, as you described. Do you have any hypothesis or theory on why that might be the case?
Sure. They're more approachable. They don't. Maybe their filters aren't as severe. They are just, more receptive because your typical female has a more emotional side than your typical male. Also consider the possibility that they know the difference between somebody who has credibility and somebody who doesn't, and they've actually focused on the ones who do not have the credibility because they have a priority in their agenda to stay hidden. So they buddy up to people who aren't going to, shall we say, rat them out.
So, Thom, when you were first putting camera traps out and kind of blazing trails, so to speak, were you at that time thinking they were just watching you? I mean, did you suspect that, hey, maybe this creature's intuitive? Like, what was going through your head back then?
Initially, no. Of course, I was baiting the ape, as we say these days in disparaging terms. I was doing everything crude. I did everything but dig a hole and cover it with sticks, like some sort of Roadrunner Wile E. Coyote episode. But little by little, I found that I was dealing with something that was on to me. And so then I sort of was forced to try some new directions. And one of them is to put these clairvoyants, these sensitives, whatever you want to call them, horse whisperers, to work and quit trying to trick them. In fact, one of the messages that Alan and April said they were getting was quit trying to trick us. And when they described that phrase that April heard, in her ears, but not from any discernible source, I knew exactly what she was referring to, and that was the cameras. They knew, because by that time I was aware of the pattern that every time we put the cameras up, the activity ceased. When we moved the cameras, the activity would resume. in the place where the cameras used to be. And we were chasing these creatures around the property with the cameras, and they were always one step ahead of us. So they had to be watching, or at least aware of whatever electronic signature these devices were giving off.
So, Thom, you've been at this a long time, not to say how many years, but, for the novice out there, those that are going to go out and, hunt one of these creatures or go, start their own research and, attempt to out-gadget one of these creatures with technologies, what could you say to help cut the corners?
I don't rain on their parade because I think it's probably a necessary step in the evolution of the Bigfoot researcher. Is they need to do that for a while just to prove to themselves that it doesn't work. So you just have to let people go there, and it may even be futile to tell them your own experience. They got to see for themselves, because they just need to work out that paradigm that there are wild apes running around in the rural fringe of North America. So rather than laugh or ridicule or even spend a bunch of time trying to change their thinking, I've learned to just let them, all right, good for you. I'm glad you're doing that. Put your trail cams out, because that means I don't have to. Please keep me informed of what you're getting. I wish you all the luck in the world, even though I know in my heart of hearts you're not going to get shit. But go ahead and try. So when I meet people of that, mindset, I just remind myself that I was there once too, and it took me 2 years to figure it out. And it does seem that the evolution happens a lot more quickly these days, because there is more information available and people have been down that trail enough times. And so the evolution happens in about 6 months for your typical individual. Although there are people who are more stubborn than that, like my good buddy Cliff Barrickman, who, is really heavily invested in the missing ape phenomenon, because he's good buddies with Jeff Meldrum, who I also have a lot of respect for, and so they really feel that if they just work this angle long enough, it will bear fruit. So I applaud his determination, and of course, even he sees these situations where nothing happens until he takes the camera away, and just stuff that to me indicates that the creatures are way smarter than we're giving them credit for. But I will say he's got a lot of commitment to a point of view, and scientifically it needs to be investigated. So I don't try too hard to change the thinking of a person like that. But I do, in my own heart, feel like, no, I'm not going to waste any more time putting up camera traps. They're smarter than that.
So, Thom, here you are, a teacher with a scientific background. You're coming at it from an academia point of view. As you kind of got into more of the paranormal edge and some of the interesting attributes of the phenomenon, how did that really affect you? How did it shake your foundation? What was that like?
Well, Alan and April are the ones who did that to me, and I'm grateful, because I was barking up the wrong tree, I think, but it's you have to go down that path in order to see a different way, but you also, of course, have to be a meticulous observer, because it's not easy to connect the dots. And when somebody says, well, we can communicate with them telepathically, I don't blame anybody for dismissing that as crazy talk. But if you just shut up and listen to what the people are saying, and then maybe even try to be scientifically nimble enough to design an experiment that can flesh that out, then, boy, that brings things to a whole nother level. And then that's what I tried to do. I tried to, well, this guy was saying I can communicate with him, and rather than laugh at him, I decided, all right, how can we design an experiment that tests this? And so it became clear to me that the idea would be to attempt to use a person like this to ask the creatures, the beings, the entities, would you please step in front of the camera? In other words, the one thing that no one had ever done up to that point is ask their permission. We're so busy trying to trick them with traps and gadgets that we just weren't giving them enough credit. So I put Steve Fredericks to work and said, ask them to step in front of the camera. And I didn't tell this to Alan and April, that I was doing this on the side, behind their backs, whatever. And lo and behold, within a matter of days, Alan and April were calling me saying, we just got the best images on the camera that we have obtained in the last 2 years of trying to do this. Within days of having Steve Fredericks ask for permission. Now, they didn't give us exactly what we wanted. You know, we didn't get the full frontal photograph, but we got these shadowy images that definitely had that kind of outline we came to associate with the Sasquatch beings. So we got decent but not great images. In other words, they seemed to understand exactly how far they could take it without being photographed directly. So we tried to refine the experiment a few more times and ask for more telling things like a bone. And we got a bone, but it wasn't a Sasquatch bone. So suddenly it started to appear that not only is this possible line of communication working, but we're finding indications that we were dealing with a set of individuals that had a sense of humor. They weren't going to cooperate with us, but they were sure going to have fun coming close. So it was amazing, the stuff we started getting. All we had to do was ask. In fact, even Steve Fredericks said, you know, the first reaction that I received was this statement that, well, isn't this amazing? You actually asked. So that's when I really felt like, oh my God, we're on to something here. So we worked it for a while, but then even Steve Fredericks, and not to mention Alan and April, just decided to move on. And after a couple of years of doing these cameras in the woods thing, I think I was ready to move on too. You know, it was starting to become such a deal that it was affecting my life in other ways. And, you know, again, this is something that the Sasquatch researcher knows all too well, is that if you really go down the rabbit hole, it can easily take over your life and start to affect it in negative ways. So when they said we're ready to stop this stuff, I was too. And but at that point, then I just had a ton of information to share that was truly, you know, on the frontier of what was known and understood about the whole subject. So I got busy and just started writing it all down, and that's when the whole publishing thing really found fertile ground in my mind, and I started writing this stuff in books.
So, Thom, obviously, like many of our Sasquatch Syndicate listeners, I really enjoyed your book, Edges of Science. I was just curious, did you have any influences on your writing style, and did you have any authors you really enjoyed growing up?
Oh, definitely. The first guy that whose book I read and I just really felt like, well, I got better stuff than he does, was Robert Michael Pyle. And he did a book with his explorations of the Bigfoot subject, and he had some interesting kind of sort of encounters, but nothing that great. All the stuff that I had gathered at Alan and April's place was way more vivid than that. So that one really, I think, lit a fire under me to, if he can do this, I should too. So I got busy writing, but then there are a couple of other paranormal authors, and one of them is William Grimstad, but his books say Jim Brandon. He's got a nom de plume because back in the 80s he was a journalist and he was writing on the subject, and he didn't want to use his real name. But now he's not so careful about it. You know, Bigfoot isn't going to besmirch your reputation the way it might have once. But anyway, so this guy William Grimstad, or as I said, Jim Brandon, has a book called The Rebirth of Pan, and he borrows heavily from the guys before him who he acknowledges, and there's two of them, John Keel, who's the Mothman Prophecies guy, and then the real granddaddy of them all is Charles Fort, who was this New Yorker back in the 20s who first started gathering paranormal reports of various kinds and publishing them. So these are historically, these are the guys. Maybe there was one other called Frank Edwards who had a couple of books back in the 60s called Stranger Than Science and Strangest of All. And they were just basically chronicles of, you know, what's with that kind of stories of people, of things that fell from the sky, or, you know, it rained frogs, or you know, people on Lover's Lane encountered a hairy being that put its face to their car windows, you know, just a whole bunch of stuff like that. So that's how they used to do it back in the day. They would just report all these random incidents and barely even group them together into coherent chapters. So I could see that the one thing that was missing in all of these guys' work is some interpretation. You know, you got to quit just reporting things case by case and offer some suggestion about what's really going on. And that was the one thing that was missing in all these books by John Green and Grover Krantz. Well, Krantz did it a little bit, but, you know, most of these other guys, John Green and stuff, were just reporting, but they weren't interpreting. And so that, I think, was the thought that I had, which might have actually been original at the time, and that is that you stick your neck out and say what you think is really going on. And so I did, and basically I was saying these things are way smarter than we realize, as evidenced by this lame-ass camera work that I did. And every time we moved the camera, the activity would move too, and then we would get the communication. And so there's a lot more to this than just some wild ape. And so I started advocating for that position, and it was definitely panned, disparaged, you know, dismissed by the guys at the time, Coleman and Dan Perez out there on the West Coast, and, you know, the guys who were sort of commenting on a regular basis about the subject, and then I put the locals out there and say, you know, these things are smarter, and you have to change up your approach. They're on to us. Well, that was just ridiculed at the time. So when the locals came out, it did not find favor right away. But as the Sasquatch topic sort of blossomed and grew in popularity, there were more people going out to the field and picking the scab, shall we say, and they were the ones who were finding that, oh my God, this guy has it. He's describing the same thing that we're experiencing. So that's when the locals sort of found favor, is when this new breed of researcher guys got out there who weren't just sitting there behind their word processor and pontificating, but, you know, weren't doing much in the way of field stuff to verify anything either way. So then the locals sort of became emblematic of the new thinking. And, thank goodness for that, because prior to that, it was basically dismissed as crazy talk.
So, Thom, kind of growing up, did you have a background in kind of unknown mysteries or the unknown, the science we don't understand, or did your research really open you up to those possibilities?
Both. I mean, as a younger person prior to my Sasquatch investigation, I was interested in books about the unknown. Frank Edwards, Charles Ford. I was aware of these guys. I didn't know that my Sasquatch interest would necessarily intersect with that stuff. But you do find yourself wondering whether, one wasn't being worked. In other words, I was maybe being led as a kid. I can see now that I had interests that led me in the direction that I ultimately took. And that was just this interest in the unknown, the scientifically unverified. And there were a few books on the subject out there, but not very many. Frank Edwards, Charles Fort. But then when I started investigating the Sasquatch mystery seriously, I was not expecting that it would be as complicated as it ended up being. But that's where I guess my awareness of these unknown phenomenon at least enabled me to consider some outside-the-box possibilities that I would not have taken on otherwise. So I was a little bit primed to receive, to consider the information that was being put in front of me that was contradicting the hypothesis that I was working, and that is that it's just a wild ape, and all I got to do is put enough cameras out there, you're going to get his picture and show it to the world. Well, that's not the case. But so I'm grateful that I read the stuff as a kid, because at least it opened my mind enough to some other possibilities that when I started encountering unexpected avenues of my investigation, that at least I was open-minded enough to take these things on and not just say, no way, Lauren Coleman says they're apes, so they must be apes.
So, Thom, in kind of, the edge of science, certainly, a lot of folks out there have had experiences or have heard stories of folks that are out researching in the field about stories of orbs prior to Sasquatch sighting, or a blue orb or an orange orb. And I was just curious if you've also heard that, and, what your thoughts are.
Oh, definitely. And what it represents, I'm still not sure, but it does correlate highly with, Sasquatch activity. I know people who say that the Sasquatch assume an orb phase. So I was like, all right, I used to laugh at that stuff, but I don't anymore. I just let everybody construct their own explanation, and I try to listen to everybody and not judge. And when you do that, you do find that there's a whole bunch of people who are out there looking for Bigfoot, as the saying goes, who have other phenomenon occur completely unexpected. And one of them is these orbs, these spherical balls of light that float horizontally or even zig and zag around amidst the trees. You do get that. And so how does that intersect with the Sasquatch phenomenon? Well, either they're doing it themselves, or you're in these highly charged, rarefied areas where paranormal activity of different sorts manifests itself. And I think that even if you're not wanting to stick your neck out and say Sasquatch has something to do with the orbs, even if you don't want to go there, I think if you put yourself out there enough times, you see that the areas where one thing happens, the other thing happens too. You have to take that on. And that, of course, led me to the next thought, and that is that all of these, or many of these paranormal phenomena intersect. And if you really want answers, you can't go out there investigating Bigfoot in a vacuum. You have to factor in these other paranormal phenomena. And, of course, that's kind of daunting because that means you got to read up on these phenomena. You have to be a student of all this other shit that you really didn't want to take on. UFOs and all of these what are called Fortean phenomena, because, you know, back in the 20s and 30s, Charles Fort was one of the only, or maybe the only guy who was collecting all of this stuff and trying to make sense of it. So I think that's the lesson for us today that is often lost by these, devotees of Bigfoot research, is that a long time ago, there were people who surmised that you have to study these phenomena in toto, not separately. And what you end up with is that they do intersect, and there is maybe this overarching idea. And the guy who probably submits that most clearly is Jim Brandon in his book Rebirth of Pan, and he says that the Earth is creating these phenomena for our benefit, but it's doing it because the Earth is alive. The Earth is a living being, and it's doing things to heal itself in light of what humanity is doing to injure it. And so it's putting up these paranormal phenomena in many cases to baffle us and to get our attention and so on. And, you know, that's kind of an egocentric thought that the Earth is doing these things to us. But basically they're saying that the Sasquatch phenomenon is one of many manifestations of this spirit world. But, you know, what they're also saying is the Sasquatch phenomenon is ghostly, that it's not these beings at all, but rather these projections that the Earth is creating almost for our benefit. That's some messed up stuff right there.
Well, and for those out there that believe that, you know, Sasquatch is a protector of the natural world and the planet, I think that, you know, it's interesting how some of those theories kind of fit in the equation. So speaking of kind of the spirit world and, you know, having been in research for a long time and having dealt with many people that are very spiritual about this subject, including those that believe that they can communicate telepathically or through mind speak or even remote viewing, have you seen any credence or anything in that research that has really jumped out at you?
You know, I think these horse whisperers, telepathic communicators, it's real. It definitely is part of this new thinking that has to be embraced if you want to get answers. And one thing is that, of course, the mind exists outside the body, that thought travels faster than light. Memory exists outside of your brain. So that, you know, when you embrace these ideas, you find that, that really is a shortcut to getting some answers to the whole Sasquatch mystery, because these beings are very much operating under these principles. That not only are they very sophisticated, but they're mentally extremely astute. And if you just embrace that, all of a sudden, the answers just flood out of that, you know, point of view. So at this point, it's like, you can communicate with them. and I don't laugh at that anymore. I cannot prove it to the satisfaction of science, but you do get answers, and you do get a consistent result, which matches what other people are getting in very separate and very distant places. Like this guy, Chris Noel, who's working it up there in New England, and there's some people in Georgia who are working the angle, the Chandlers, and it's amazing how consistent the results are among these people who are working the angle that you can communicate with the Sasquatch, and they're very sentient beings. They're very concerned about the health of the planet, and they're hoping for a higher degree of human awareness and sensitivity, and it's coming along.
Well, as advocates for the planet, Paul and I certainly hope you're right. It's just such a cool theory to believe that there could be this creature out there, this being that's protecting the natural world and keeping man from doing damage to the forest. And if we are doing damage, it's sending us signals through gifting or encounters, and it's scaring people off to protect the natural world. And what a great theory, and what a great story if that's truly the case.
Thom, as a science teacher and having initially come at this from a scientific method, at some level you crossed over from scientific experimentation to just open-mindedness and plain open data gathering. Can you talk about crossing over from that scientific methodology to data gathering?
I really, as a science teacher guy, I really tried to apply the principles of science, and I found it didn't work. You can't construct an experiment that can be replicated to the satisfaction of science. And I really believed that you could, but then I found that you couldn't, and it was explained to me by a rather savvy dude named Henry Franzoni that the reason was that you're dealing with an intelligent entity, and you cannot do science on intelligent entities because you can't isolate variables. In other words, you're not allowed to put people in a cage and study them scientifically, and the same is true with the Sasquatch. They're just not going to cooperate with your scientifically constructed experiment. So you're not a scientist, even though you wish you could be. Now, again, I encourage the Cliff Berkmans and Jeff Meldrums of the world to pursue it scientifically, even though I know they're probably not going to get anywhere. But I'll just shut up and let them try. And I'm interested, and I sort of pay attention to their results, even though it's sort of become predictable. But meanwhile, I've decided after, getting with guys like Henry Franzoni that I'm actually more of a spy than I am a scientist. That is, I'm doing intelligence gathering, not science, because you can't do science on intelligent beings. We didn't find Osama bin Laden by doing science. We just gathered unverifiable bits of information, and by studying a whole bunch of sticky notes on the wall, we figured out where he must be. That's not science. That's intelligence gathering, and basically most people who are pursuing the Bigfoot mystery at this point are, whether they realize it or not, they're doing intelligence gathering, because you can't do science on intelligent entities, whether it's Osama bin Laden or Bigfoot. They're too smart for science techniques, but you can gather intelligence, and so that's essentially what we're doing. Nothing is provable in the world of intelligence gathering, but you can find patterns that work and predict the future, and so that's, I think, what I ended up doing or embracing as a more sophisticated way of getting to the bottom of some of these mysteries is you're just gathering bits of information and see where they lead you, which is what Charles Fort was doing in the 30s and John Keel in the 60s and Jim Brandon in the 80s. So it really, really helps people to read some of these other people who came before them, and I think that's probably the mistake that most Bigfoot researchers today are making, is that they get everything from the internet, which is fine, and it's free, but it's snippets of information, and it doesn't really give you a window on what has been done before you by these guys, including Robert Michael Pyle and even Peter Byrne. But if you read what Peter Byrne and John Green were saying and doing back in their day, you hopefully go, all right, well, I'm not going to repeat their thing, because they shook that tree pretty thoroughly and they got nothing. So don't keep doing the same thing that hasn't worked in the past. But it certainly means that you're going out onto some pretty thin ice, scientifically especially, and so that opens you up to ridicule. So, you know, I understand that guys like Dr. Meldrum are going to disparage my work, and I don't take that personally. But I just sort of, my message to everybody is everybody just do your own thing, whether it's flesh and blood, paranormal, anything in between. Everybody just do your own thing, and try not to judge the other people, but also share whatever you're getting. And that's the key thing, and that is a principle of science, is you have to share your results. And in the days of the Four Horsemen, you know, Peter Byrne, John Green, Rene DeHinden, Grover Krantz, everybody thought, oh, they were just weeks away from making the big discovery themselves. So there wasn't any sharing. Everybody was hoarding and hiding their information and their locations. And that is a terrible mistake, because you just aren't finding out what other people are getting and doing. And so it's very easy to bark up the wrong tree and just have no idea that you're spinning your wheels doing the same thing that other people are doing and getting nowhere.
Well, right. And that's, you know, the beauty of a syndicate. We're a group of individuals and organizations combined to promote a common interest. And so we're very open, certainly encourage others to come forward and share, you know, their data as well. So Thom, let's talk about trackways. And I know that, you know, you hit on the London Trackway in your book. And for those that haven't picked up Edges of Science, I highly recommend reading that book. But just talk about trackways. And I know that you've had experiences also with tracks just stopping in the middle of nowhere, and as if the creature just walked off the page. Just curious what you could share about tracks and what you've experienced.
Well, I think that when we find long strings of tracks, they're probably for our benefit. I guess it's possible that the creature's just kind of trucking around and taking it all in, but it does sometimes seem that the tracks are maybe sort of directed, and once you embrace the possibility that they're intelligent, then of course you have to consider that they know that they're leaving tracks, and they know that we value them. Most tracks historically that were found were like a single track in a situation that seemed pretty deliberate. So even historically, I think a lot of the tracks were essentially calling cards. You know, it's like they're leaving their business card there for you to find. You find these tracks that are in a one patch of disturbed earth, like a molehill. They could have easily stepped around that piece of fresh earth, but it seems like they planted that foot right there so that it would be found. So that's where I started to change my thinking again and suppose that in many cases tracks are a calling card. They know they're leaving them, and they know who's going to find them. So once again, we start to get forced into the possibility that they know exactly what they're doing, and much of what they do is directed at us in general, or even certain researcher guys who are frequenting the area, and they sort of decide to give them something to mess with their head a little bit, you know. So I think you have to look at tracks nowadays with the possibility that they're deliberate and that they are serving us up a statement of what they're about. In many cases, these statements are sort of misleading too. You know, I think they're one of the possibilities that some of these early authors noticed, Fort and Brandon and Keel, is that we're being messed with. Is that there's a sense of humor that's manifest in some of this stuff, and B, that it's sort of meant for us to find. And like I say, that's sort of an arrogant thought that it's directed at us individually or as a group of beings, but I think that is consistent with this idea that the creatures know that we're trying to study them, and they're not going to cooperate, but they're sort of at times going to have some fun with us, throwing us a bone, you know, and seeing what we do, which again is what intelligence gatherers have learned is that when you're spying on somebody, whether it's the Russians or the terrorist groups, that they deliberately plant things for us to find, and one of the reasons they do that is they're trying to gauge the opposition and learn how the opposition is going to react when you throw something out there, and I think that too is what the Sasquatch phenomenon includes, is this deliberate attempt to see what our reaction is when we find these things, and that they're somehow observing from the shadows and engaging our reaction to this evidence as we find it. So they leave the trackway, and then we come running with our bags of plaster, and they're watching from the tree line as we do our business, and they're studying us by throwing down these shreds of evidence and watching our reaction.
So, Tom, back to Edges of Science, and in your book, you talk a little bit about the trickster behavior and the coincidental things that happen out there. And I think you talked a little bit about a gentleman who lost his gun. He searched the area many times only to find it. But can you talk about some of those stories and experiences you've had, and really, some of that trickster or comedic behavior that you've experienced?
He dropped his gun in the wilderness, and he went back looking for it, and there it was for him to find in a place where he was certain that it did not fall on its own. So, nothing that he could prove to the satisfaction of science, but he was convinced with every bone in his body that something was aware of the fact that he lost his gun when he lost it, and that same something had no interest in keeping his gun, this nice Smith & Wesson pistol, and so it also seemed to understand that he was going to come back looking for it and get this piece of shit out of here. It left it on the log for him to find. So that has happened, and also we've had situations where interesting little devices have mysteriously disappeared from camp. One time, Buddy and I were investigating this, squatchy area. I hate to use that phrase, and he put his altimeter down on the rocks, and then we walked away, and then realized that he had left his fancy little device, and we returned to that spot minutes later, and the thing was gone. And we were so far out on this ridge that there's no way in hell that there was another individual out there. It was a windswept ridge, and we would have seen it, but we walked off of this ridge and into the forest, and then we doubled back, and in that short period of time, that thing disappeared. So they don't always give the stuff back. But if they don't want it, and it does seem that weapons are in that category of things they don't want, then they'll put it there for you to find, and by golly, it's been moved.
So, Thom, I've got a few listeners here that are hitting us on social media with some questions. But before we get to those, I want to talk about the chapter Zoo Hypothesis in Edges of Science. And it's got a wide angle lens, I guess, as we approach that chapter. But we had Scott Walter on the podcast late last fall, and we were talking about Mima mounds and the correlation to giants and potentially Sasquatch. But can you share your insight on Mima mounds and really what conclusions you drew?
Well, it's pretty speculative, but basically throughout the continent, these piles of dirt occur, which are variously attributed to natural forces or Indians. And especially in the Midwest, there are these enormous mounds which are attributed to this ancient race that they call the Mound Builders. And it's generally supposed that Indians made them, even though the Indian tribes that still exist today say we had no connection to these things. But throughout the continent and indeed the world, you get these piles of dirt. And in many cases, they have a structure to them. They call them henges, like Stonehenge. So there's dirt henges, there's wood henges, and there's stone henges, depending on what they're made of. But so you get these henges, as they're sometimes called, because they're designs made of dirt, or they're just random piles of dirt, but they occur continent-wide. And they are discussed by some of these early authors like Jim Brandon and Charles Fort, but nobody has a coherent explanation, it seems, about their origin, although there's a lot of speculation. And again, this is where Jim Brandon says the Earth itself is creating these features. But to me, if I sort of pursue it with a flesh and blood and scientific point of view and look for an explanation, I find myself wondering whether you're dealing with piles of earth that were moved from somewhere else, not to create mystic designs and places of worship or spirituality, but just because they had dirt that they had to get rid of. And so they put it into these designs which kind of confuse us, and we get all involved in trying to figure out what the design is saying. Well, the design is secondary to the idea that they have an enormous amount of dirt to get rid of, and they got to somehow conceal where this dirt is coming from, because what it possibly represents is an indication that there's a lot of subterranean digging going on, and so they're just like any mining activity. You got this dirt that you got to get rid of, and if you're smart, you don't pile the dirt at the mouth of the mine, because that's going to give away the location of your mine. So you truck the dirt a little bit away from the situation and then dump it, and then maybe make it into some sort of like structure that seems symbolic of something, and therefore confuses the whole possibility that they're just trying to get rid of this dirt because they got these huge underground excavations that they don't want us to know about. So what it all says to me is that somebody or something is comfortably ensconced subterranean on planet Earth, terra firma. And a long time ago, when these installations were being made, they were moving this dirt around, and they put it into designs which baffle us to this day. But to me, it indicates that there's something major subterranean happening on this planet. And of course, the question then is, well, what would that be? And I guess the simplest answer that I can come up with is that extraterrestrials have been coming and going from Earth for a long time, and they are installed subterranean. So they're not from space when we see indications of what we call extraterrestrials, they're here. But they come from the Earth, just like Jim Brandon was saying. But does that mean that the Earth itself is alive? Not necessarily, but there's living beings within the Earth that are determined to stay hidden from our scrutiny, from our inspection. And, of course, people go, well, why is that? And you kind of go, well, I don't know, but there was a Star Trek plot where they talked about the prime directive, and that is when you visit another planet, the most important rule is do not interfere with these yobos that live there. Don't just manifest yourself so that they suddenly see you as this deity that arrived from above. That just sort of like wrecks their own natural evolution of thought. So stay out of sight and let these yobos be the yobos that they are until they wise up on their own. And I think, to me, that explains a whole bunch about what's happening in the paranormal realm. We're the science experiment. We're the creatures in the zoo, and they're watching us from afar, just like they do in zoos today. More and more in zoos, they have the animals living in enclosures that hide our presence with two-way mirrors and different things, so we can see the otters swimming around, but the otters can't see us. And when they create those kinds of enclosures for the animals in the zoo, and they're not constantly being disturbed by the presence of visitors or even zoo employees, the animals behave much more naturally. And then they start to reproduce and do things that they didn't think were possible in the zoo. As soon as you get these people's faces out of these animals' little world that we've created for them. So I think that's a definite lesson, and that, hence the whole zoo hypothesis that
sure.
we're living in this zoo and we're being observed from afar, and that basically summarizes the entire paranormal realm.
And wouldn't it be interesting to observe the human race as an ant farm? Certainly something to behold.
Yes, we are the ant farm.
All right, so let's get into some of the listeners' questions. And when we started the interview, I had posted on social media that we were chatting, and we got a few in. One was from Jim Schmidt from Fort Davis, Texas, and he had mentioned, Tom, I had seen you on a TV show. I'm not sure which one. It might have been Finding Bigfoot. And you demonstrated a wood knock by using your hands and vocalizations. Just curious on your theory. Do you think that they use rocks, sticks, or vocalizations to imitate signals?
Most of what we're hearing is created by whatever vocal mechanisms they have, whether it's vocal cords, sinuses, I don't know. But the idea is that when you hear these wood knocks, that they're not whacking a stick on a tree, but rather they're making that noise vocally by clapping their cupped hands together in front of an open mouth. And if you try this enough times, you start to find that you can make a noise that sounds exactly like a stick hitting a tree, but you don't have to go around and find the perfect stick and whack the perfect tree. If you do go around whacking trees with sticks, you find that it's actually, it doesn't usually work very well. You have to have the right stick and you have to have the right tree. And when you're out there and you're hearing these tree knocks in a place like Skookum Meadow up there near Mount St. Helens, it's moving around, and yet they always make a perfect knock. And when you try to duplicate that yourself, it's really difficult to do. Most sticks that you find on the ground don't make a very good noise because they're rotten and full of water, and It just doesn't work. So, you know, a lot of these guys will carry a baseball bat around. So is the Sasquatch carrying around this hickory stick so that they can make these tree knocks when they want to? I really don't think so. I think there's another and simpler mechanism at work, and that is just their vocal capabilities. But once again, you know, this is an area of huge debate, but I am of the view that they can pretty much make any noise they want. They're marvelous mimics, and they can make any creature noise, you know, so you get owl sounds that come from down low instead of up high. You get human sounding screams. You get a whole host of sound effects. The one that guy was telling me about just last night, pretty common, is this crashing through the bushes that is louder than it needs to be, you know, almost like a bulldozer crashing around and surrounding the location of these individuals. And then they are terrified as it's happening because it's dark. Then the next day they go out looking for all these broken limbs and turned over trees that must have happened from the sound of all this racket that was going on, and yet there's no knocked over trees. Nothing is disturbed. So even sounds of crashing branches and snapping limbs, they can make that noise too, apparently, because when you look for the evidence that should exist from all this noise that occurred in the dark, it's not there. It's just not there.
Yeah, you think
so either they're making these, or they're able to sort of plant the noises in your brain by triggering neurons or synapses, or, you know, it's possible that they can just make the noises heard by your brain even though they don't correspond to anything that's actually happening on the landscape. That's pretty paranormal stuff right there. And until you've had it happen to you, I, again, don't blame anybody for rolling their eyes and saying that's just crazy talk. But the fact is that quite a number of people have had this crashing of branches happen encircling their campsite, and then only to find that there is no corresponding disturbance in the forest from all of this noise that they perceived. So clearly the creatures are making noises for our benefit, and they're doing it artificially. They're not crashing through the timber, and they're not whacking trees with sticks, which makes sense to me because it's actually bad for the trees to hit them with a baseball bat. You smash the cambium layer, and that part of the cambium dies. And so going around whacking trees is actually sort of ecologically a little bit unsound, except that there's so many trees, you're probably not going to do a lot of damage to the forest at large. But the Sasquatch wouldn't do that. They wouldn't go around whacking trees because they revere the landscape, I think, and aren't going to defile it in that way. But they're certainly, they know how to make the same noise, again, for our benefit, or maybe their own. I mean, it does take on the appearance of some sort of signaling. There's some people who feel like if there's two people out in the woods, you hear two whacks, and if there's three people in the woods, you hear three whacks. And so maybe what they're doing is saying there's three of them, and here they're over there, and it might be some sort of signaling system as well.
All right, we've got a couple more here. One came from Ray Malinto. Sorry if I said your name wrong. He's from Irvine, California. He says, Chuck, I know you and Tom are both very open to the realm of theories on the subject. Have you had any experiences on cattle mutilation and Sasquatch? And can you ask Tom if he's ever hung out with Linda Moulton Howe?
I wish. You know a guy who used to date her, Dave Mann, went out with Linda Moulton Howe years ago, and, you know, still speaks very highly of her. So, no, but she's in the Southwest, Arizona or Cali. I'm up here in the Northwest. But I certainly am in awe of two things. Number one, her intellectual, you know, commitment to the topic, and the fact that she's been probing these mysteries for decades. So she is definitely one of the leaders of it all, and a person who puts herself out there in a big, big way and really picks the scab of, you know, government monitoring and you know, sometimes bad things happen to these people who put themselves out there, you know. So when a person like her makes her interest and commitment to these subjects known and goes on air and says the stuff that she says, you just half fear that she's putting herself at risk. But she's been doing it for years and years. So there's one person who's been able to whistle past the graveyard for a long time and not have something bad happen to her. So I have nothing but admiration and respect for people like that, and she is one of the real courageous pioneers of it all. But have I ever met her? No. Would I like to? Yes.
I just want to echo Tom's sentiment. Linda Moulton Howe is absolutely amazing. We were lucky enough to meet Linda at Alien Con a couple of years back, and Linda was kind enough to share some articles from her publications on cattle mutilations. You can find that at SasquatchSyndicate.com under Alien Theory and Cattle Mutilation. Also, just another note, Linda will be appearing at Alien Con 2 in Pasadena, California in June. We're also going to have a booth there. So, Ray, hopefully you can make it out, and thanks for your question.
Our next question is from Janet Sims from Junction City, Kansas, and she writes, Tom, I saw an episode of Joe Rogan Questions Everything, and it was about Bigfoot. You were on the episode. Joe stopped by your school, and during that episode, you had a plaster cast that you dropped at Joe's feet. Was that scripted or impromptu, and how was your experience shooting with Sci-Fi and Joe Rogan?
No, I did that just extemporaneously for effect. So I'm glad someone saw it. I must say, when you make yourself available to these media folks like Joe Rogan, you never know how you're going to be portrayed. And in fact, once bitten, you know, twice shy, you usually get sort of hung out to dry. And this was the case with the Joe Rogan thing. You know, he fancies himself as a comedian. I don't think he's a very funny comedian, but he tries. And so he was one of these guys who definitely took the interview and then edited it behind closed doors to make himself look bad and everybody else look stupid. So, you know, you have to expect that when you play ball with the media. Nothing against you guys.
No offense taken, I think.
But no, he was just looking to have fun and ridicule the Sasquatch thing, and I sort of sensed that. So I wasn't in any way shocked or surprised when the show that he made was basically a send-up. In other words, here's these crazy Sasquatch researchers, and they pretended that they were going to get some DNA work done, and of course, then they took the tissue that I gave them to Todd Dishotel, and of course he poo-pooed everything, and so yeah, the Joe Rogan thing was kind of what you learn to expect from the media. They're going to ridicule you by way of clever editing of the video that you give them, and that's what he did.
And our last question was from Tom Peterson. He's from Hillsboro, Oregon, and he writes, Tom, is Hopsquatch really over? Do you guys think you'll ever get anything going in Portland again? And will you be at any upcoming conferences in 2018?
The guy who did the Hopsquatch thing, Guy Edwards, is like a lot of people, just trying to keep his own life going and his business. And so I think he finally decided that he was done organizing monthly Sasquatch gatherings like Ray Crow used to do. You know, there were other people before Guy who were doing the same thing, and the most notable was Ray Crow. He, for years and years, had monthly Sasquatch meetings, first at a used bookstore and then at a diner in North Portland. And then Ray Crow finally decided to hang up his podium, and then Guy took it over. And the real clever twist that Guy added is just to have one of these Sasquatch gatherings, but do it in a bar for a change, so that at least people could sit around and drink beer while they're talking about Sasquatch, which is a match made in heaven. Drinking beer and talking about Bigfoot just works. So that's what Guy did, is he had Bigfoot meetings at a brew pub. And I would encourage anybody to take up the mantle and do that again. But everybody wears down eventually, and so Guy did too. I'm always amazed at these people who do all this organizing. I wouldn't have the energy to do it. It would drive me to an early grave. But I am impressed by these people who do these events and organize them, especially these large conferences. So in the future, in early March, there's one in Ocean Shores, Washington. And rather than being just Sasquatch, John E. Manson does this thing that he calls Paranormal Summit or UFO Summit. He basically has a conference where he invites speakers on a whole host of different paranormally related topics, UFOs, Bigfoot, cattle mutilations, you name it. And I really favor those because, as we were saying before, I think the connection between paranormal events is probably something that is worth exploring more fully. I think that's where the real answers lie. So the Paranormal Summit is in Ocean Shores, Washington. I think that's March 2nd and 3rd. I'll be at that one. And then in early May, like 5th or 6th of May, Dave Paulides in Colorado is organizing a similar sort of paranormal summit, and that's in Denver in early May. And let's see, what does he call it? He calls it the Mile High Mystery Conference. And I like that name. That's kind of cute because, now that Colorado has legal weed,
right.
the Mile High thing opens up a whole other interpretation. But it's important to keep a sense of humor with this stuff. So when I go to these things, I get up there and make every joke I can think of. And it's maybe disrespectful, but it sure makes it more fun.
All right. Well, Tom, thanks again for coming on Sasquatch Syndicate. We really appreciate it. I know our listeners do as well. It was a long-awaited visit, and it's really on me. I just didn't have although Tom and I talk, I just didn't have the time to coordinate schedules. So it's really on me, but glad we were finally able to have you on, and it was a real honor.
Okay. Well, pleasure's all mine. And if there's a take-home message, it's that don't study any subject in a vacuum. You have to widen your area of investigation, which does complicate things more because you have to read a whole bunch more, and you you can't just study Bigfoot. You have to study everything. That's pretty daunting. And it just means a whole lot more homework than I think sometimes people were wanting to take on. But I think that is the frontier these days, is finding a connection between seemingly unrelated paranormal phenomena. And some of these early authors have done that. Jim Brandon, the Rebirth of Pan. And basically what they're saying is that the Earth itself is in some form responsible for conjuring some of this phenomena. And so, that's a heavy thought.
Yeah, thanks for that. And Thom, for the listeners out there, how do they follow your work, and where can they contact you?
I do a blog, and it's called Thom Squatch. And Thom is, the Welsh spelling of Thom is Thom, which is how my first name is spelled. So if you just type in Thom Squatch with Thom, the silent H, Welsh are known for their silent consonants. So there it is. And so I do keep a blog, and it's pretty easy to find. All you have to do is Google Thom Squatch, and it'll be there. Or if you just type in Thom Powell, it'll take you right there. But it basically delves into various paranormal phenomena, UFOs, mounds, Sasquatch, any mystery that I can think of. I try to study it for a while and then offer my assessment of that mystery and how it may factor in with some of these other mysteries.
So there you have it from Thom Powell, again, researcher and author of Edges of Science. Again, you can pick that up at SasquatchSyndicate.com under book club. So Thom, thanks again for coming on the show, and we'll look forward to seeing you at an upcoming conference.
Take care.
This concludes our February 2018 podcast. Sasquatch Syndicate will return on Thursday, March 1st. Thanks to all our listeners and those who have been out to our website and those who have joined us on social media. Sasquatch is a controversial subject, so for all the believers and disbelievers and those that will tell you they have all the answers, just remember, we're flying through space at 700 miles per hour. Buckle up.